think I'm starting to realize not everything has to be alright. Just keep your head up and hold on tight. Shake off the dirt and throw it right down the line. Go on, get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, go get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, yo. Go on, get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, go get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, yo. Can't stop moving, I can't stop moving. Got a really good feeling, I got a really good feeling. Can't stop moving, I can't stop moving. Can't stop moving, I can't stop moving. Got a really good feeling, I got a really good feeling. Can't stop. Oh, it's a good day to be alive. I count my blessings and keep them all at my side. There ain't no stopping us, we're starting to ride. We keep on running and we're feeling alright. Go on, get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, go get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, yo. Can't stop moving, I can't stop moving. Got a really good feeling, I got a really good feeling. Can't stop moving, I can't stop moving. I think I'm starting to realize not everything has to be alright. Just keep your head up and hold on tight. Shake off the dirt and throw it right down the line. Go on, get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, go get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, yo. Go on, get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, go get loose. Yeah, you better get used to me, yo. Can't stop moving, I can't stop moving.
leave my message. Hopefully someone sees it.
Towards the middle of March 2020, the world began to look and feel a lot different for all of us. Scary and confusing sights and sounds were all around us. Then, the stay-at-home and shelter-in-place orders effectively established a lockdown as we began to see people we cared about around us get sick and in all too many cases die. The reports of Black and Latinx communities disproportionately impacted by COVID-related deaths and infections invaded our consciousness. Mutual aid efforts sprang up in response to these reports, and the reality hit home that millions of people who call America home were out of work, unable to pay their rent and mortgage, incapable of putting food on their tables, or ensuring their children received a quality education. As we were attempting to adjust to the disruption the global pandemic brought to our lives, we sat transfixed to our screens watching George Floyd callously murdered in broad daylight. And the world changed again. Collectively, we awakened to the reality of simultaneous pandemics. Not only was our ability to stay healthy under attack, our capacity for economic security had been compromised. And we also had a front row seat to the pervasive nature of structural racism. The reckoning was upon us. Change wasn't just a coming, it was now here. Community organizing groups across the country were engaging their base to not just meet the needs of their communities, but to create new paradigms by which local and national institutions had to respond. Government, philanthropy, civic groups, corporations, etc., everyone was being ushered into a new world by organizers. The world was introduced to terms like BIPOC and racial equity, and then came the backlash. I'm sure most of us can remember where we were when we received the news that the U.S. Capitol had been breached and blood spilled in the People's House, which wasn't just about the results of an election, but more importantly, about a belief that a way of life was being stolen from those who considered themselves the true patriots. Months removed from these events, we at the Wieboldt Foundation invite you to reflect on what we've seen, heard, and experienced over the last 18 months to bring those lessons forward to shape the future our grandchildren will be born into. Doing what we've been doing for the past 5 decades and coinciding with the Wieboldt Foundation's 100th anniversary, we're here to interrogate how the critical systems we rely upon can better serve our communities. We invite you to join us as we hold conversations to inspire us to change the way forward, centering the experiences of the people most impacted by these issues and framed from the expertise of the organizers who work to address these issues daily. Thank you for being here. And as you watch our panel discussion tonight, please ask yourself what you can do in this moment to get us all a little closer to where we need to be as a nation. Enjoy.
Good evening. Welcome to Changing the Way Forward, Organizing and Policy Reform. This is the third and final entree into this exploration that's being brought to you by the Wieboldt Foundation. And it's exactly how it sounds, changing the way forward. We're looking for a pathway forward to get where we want to be with regard to a number of issues that challenge our communities, not just here in Chicago, but across the country. I'm your moderator for tonight. My name is Alden Lowry. I'm the senior editor of the Race, Class, and Communities desk at WBEZ. And today the topic is housing. The pandemic has shown us our weaknesses in a whole host of areas, from healthcare to the economy, and certainly to housing. If not for eviction moratoriums and literally billions of dollars in rental assistance, things would be far worse than they are, and things aren't very good right now. We are literally treading water. But the good news is today we're going to have a down and dirty, nitty-gritty conversation with 4 people who are very steeped with what's happening, both on the ground, fighting people who are fighting eviction or helping people who are fighting eviction, people who are being displaced, but also who see a 30,000-foot view at City Hall, State Capitol, other places of government where they're arguing for policy change and things that they think can help those folks on the ground that they're working with every day. So we are going to dive right in. A couple of ground rules for our panelists who are going to introduce themselves here in just a moment. We are asking for 2 minutes on your responses. For your opening question, you can take 3 minutes if you need it. Later on, we are going to have some Q&A. Folks in the audience, I know, although I can't see your faces, I know you're frothing underneath there, just ready to dive into the conversation. As you've been told, if you have a question during the course of the conversation, raise your hand and we'll get your questions in as well. All right, everybody ready to go? All right. Christian, why don't we start with you? Why don't you introduce yourself? And in this opening dialogue, we're just asking you to tell us where you see where we are with regard to housing. What are our challenges and our issues? So take it away.
Sure. Well, Alden, thank you. Thank you to the Wieboldt Foundation for having us. My name is Christian. I'm the Director of Housing at Logan Square Neighborhood Association. We've been around for almost 60 years. We're an organization of organizations, so we have members that range from churches to block clubs, social service providers, nonprofit developers, and more. And I want to share, my mother brought me to this country when she was a teenager, and she came here as a single mom in search of a better life for me, for my siblings. We were very lucky that we were able to purchase a home in Logan Square, a 3-flat, and that came with a lot of benefits because of the type of housing stock it is, the 3-flat. Why? Because my parents we lived on the 3rd floor, but we could rent the first unit and the basement to friends and family, right? People we trust. And they're still renting out those units at $600 a month. In Logan Square, where a new studio will rent for $1,900 a month. And so for us, our strategy, our belief, core belief at LSNA is that we need to protect that natural, affordable housing stock of mom and pop owned 2 and 3 flats, because the data is clear. Those are the affordable units that exist in Chicago. Those are the units that are large enough for the families that are black and brown in Chicago. And so we need a strategy to preserve those. I do want to share, the first time my brother was put in handcuffs, he was 14 years old. This happened in front of his high school, Carl Schurz High School, while he was waiting for the bus to go home. And so these stories I'm sharing, my brother getting put into handcuffs as a kid, my mother moving to this country, also as a kid herself with babies. These stories are not uncommon. This is a story of Chicago. And so I think to paint a picture for the housing and what we're experiencing now, I just want to make it clear that I truly believe we live in an apartheid. And our analysis has to be clear enough that we can see that and communicate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Michelle, why don't you take it away?
Good evening. I'm Michelle Gilbert, and I'm Legal and Policy Director at Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. We represent Chicago area tenants in eviction court, building court, and in fair housing cases. I've been a legal aid attorney for 30 years. So when I say my position is or my policy is, it comes from 30 years of talking to tenants about their housing situation. But if I'm really going to identify who I am, I'm the daughter of people who stayed. In the 70s, when my neighborhood was blockbusted and changed, my family stayed in that neighborhood, and it completely made me who I am today. And so when I've had, in the really recent past, discussions about how we need to apply a race equity lens to things, I almost don't understand, because it's always been about race to me. If we're talking about where we're going, thinking about what we've been through in the pandemic, this is my hope. The pandemic has taught us that prevention is better than treatment. It is better to wear these masks than to get COVID and get the treatment. And I hope that we apply that lesson to housing. It is better to prevent evictions, prevent homelessness, than try to cure it. And I feel like I've sometimes been in the wilderness, this kind of person who said, we're not going to end homelessness until we stop the machine at the Daily Center and the suburban courthouses that makes 30,000 families a year also homeless. And maybe, having thought about the difference between prevention and treatment over the last 18 months, we can apply that to housing. And I remember when we would lobby for $3 million for homeless prevention funds. Illinois has $2 billion in homeless prevention funds, emergency rental assistance now. I hope we don't need $2 billion in the future, but I hope that this idea that putting money into our communities to protect tenancies, to invest in housing, is something that continues forward when we finally get out of this pandemic period.
All right, we're going to go to our two virtual panelists. Sophia, can you hear me?
I can. Can you all hear me?
Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what do you think some of our key challenges are with regard to housing right now?
I'd be happy to. So hi, everyone. It's so nice to join you. My name is Sophia Lopez. I use she, her pronouns, and I am based in San Antonio, Texas. I work at an organization called the Action Center on Race and the Economy. And we're a national organization that works at the intersection of racial justice and Wall Street accountability. So what that means for the folks who are here, we do community organizing support to people who have campaigns against particularly corporate actors or Wall Street actors, and oftentimes those are one and the same, right? So I have the privilege of getting to work with organizers across the country who are focused on housing and in particular corporate campaigns. And that ties into my analysis of kind of where we're at and what some of the biggest challenges are. I think talking about power is exactly the framing that we need to be using, right? So we can come up with all of these different kinds of policy prescriptions, but unless we acknowledge who actually has the power to make those policy ideas a reality or kill them, then I think we'll end up continually frustrated. So one of the things I find myself often talking about is, you know, we could have, for example, I did some research a couple of years ago in support of Prop 10 in California. That was an initiative to try and allow rent control across the state, right? And the research that I did was looking at campaign contributions from some of the biggest private equity funders and identifying who was behind the hundreds of millions of dollars that were going into billions, I'm sorry, that was going into the campaign to actually stop a necessary tenant protection and just one of many. So to me, I think, you know, we can talk about different AMI levels and what it is that we need to build, but we need to confront who actually is swaying the outcomes of the decisions and policy conversations that we're having. I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you so much for that, Sophia. Jeremy, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Great. Please introduce yourselves for our audience here in person and online, and tell us what you think some of our key challenges are with regard to housing at this moment.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me tonight. Welcome. I'm happy to come to you virtually. So, you know, I think the thing that comes to mind when you ask how do we get here and what are the challenges we're facing. I mean, the biggest challenge that we're facing is that we're living in what we call at Liberation Generation an oppression economy. And this is an economy, and this is the economy that we're living in. And it's the economy that is where the act of theft, exclusion, and exploitation is a means for wealthy individuals to make profit. The reality is that racism in this country is profitable. And we see that no more in stark relief than we do in our housing market. You know, our housing market is built upon the theft of indigenous land. It thrives from the exclusion of Black and brown communities, and it wields profit by exploiting Black and brown people. And it is this private market that we've created that is really at the center of what we face today. And our public policy is, to me, so backwards because it assumes the reality, it assumes the existence of this private market that is set up to exploit Black and brown people, right? You have the low-income housing tax credit, which uses the private market to provide housing. You have housing choice vouchers, which again is a subsidy to landlords, not to the people who are receiving them from the government. And it is the assumption of that this market is going to be the one that provides housing to all people, and that exists, that is really setting the stage for the type of exploitation and the real challenges that people are faced with in the marketplace. Because again, it is designed to exploit and to extract wealth and income from Black and brown people. And if we're going to move forward, that's what we're going to talk about here today, we have to start to think about housing solutions that are not reliant upon this market that is again, where racism is profitable.
Fantastic. Thank you, sir. Okay, so we've got a good foundation to start with. I just want to come back to a couple things that you all mentioned in your opening remarks. Michelle, I'll start with you. You know, we talked at the top about, you know, the pandemic and eviction moratoriums, billions of dollars in rental assistance. The rental assistance is going to dry up at some point. The moratoriums are already over. How do we prevent? The only way we've really been able to prevent evictions over the last 18 months has been because we've been under those moratoriums. Moving forward without that protection, how do we prevent evictions? What's the best way to go at that?
We need to have continued rental assistance. Like I said, I hope that it isn't, that we don't need $2 billion a year in the future, because, I mean, I hope that the economy gets better than that. But I think, you know, I don't know. It's hard to imagine I get to be this age and still be so, I don't know, hopeful. But people were at risk of eviction who have not been at risk of eviction before. And maybe being on that edge makes them realize that we're all really close to the edge. I mean, some people don't have a month in savings. I've represented people who are being evicted for owing $59. You know, some people, maybe they have a couple of months, but now we have, many of us, I've been very fortunate, many of us have been very close to the edge. And maybe that makes us feel some compassion to one another. So we've made incremental change. We have made changes in the Cook County court system. And it sounds incredibly self-interested, I'll own that. But one thing that we need is tenants need lawyers. And if the tenants didn't need lawyers, then the landlords wouldn't have them. And we know that 80% of landlords come to eviction court with attorneys, and only like 11 or 18% of tenants do. And so we need to have funding for lawyers for tenants.
Just one quick follow-up. I know one of the things that they've been trying in eviction court as it was coming back was having literally mediators on hand to try to help with tenants and landlords. Has that been helpful?
We settle eviction cases every day. I mean, you get two lawyers in a room. What we do is settle cases, you know, and it's better. For me, I even like it when the landlord has an attorney, because then they don't have that personal investment. And, you know, we get the rental assistance in. I'm not going to pretend like, oh, but it is better. Like, more access to the attorney. Have to be able to settle. We are people in their home.
Christian, a very interesting story that you opened us up with. You talked about the 2-3 flats being literally like lifeblood. Doing $600 a little bit square is unheard for size. It seems almost almost like
Pipe dream that could be something that we could sustain. What's your path forward, you think, to preserving those units at those price and getting more online? I mean, do you have some strategies that you think will help us get more of those types of situations?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen cases where a 3-flat will go on the market. Maybe it's being foreclosed, and it'll be put on the market for $40,000 a year. A developer will buy it, do a paint job, add a new kitchen counter, put it back on the market for $400,000 a year. We need to be able to compete with these private market developers to acquire land and property that we can maintain as affordable forever. And that is something that we are starting to do in partnership with groups like Lucha, Center for Changing Lives. We've established a community land trust. Just recently, about a month ago, we put our first home on the market. So to put things into context, you know, what level of subsidy are we using for a development like Lincoln Yards? It's in the billions, right? If there's 2 flats and 3 flats on the market for $40,000 throughout Chicago, why are we giving billions of dollars to build this rich, yet another rich white people-only neighborhood on the north side of Chicago when we could be using those billions of dollars to acquire property and sell those homes to families? And you know what? That's not a pipe dream. I mean, why do we have a racial disparity in this country when it comes to wealth? It's because of programs like the one I'm describing that were done in the 30s, 40s, 50s, but they were only done for white people. So I don't think it's a big mystery how we address poverty in this country. We've done it before. We did it for white folks. We need to do that again for people of color so that we can finally live in a truly equitable society.
Your remarks take me to neighborhoods like Inglewood and West Inglewood that literally lost a slew of those kinds of buildings, 2 and 3 flats and some, you know, courtyard buildings in the aftermath of the mortgage meltdown and the economic crisis we had more than a decade ago. Buildings that fell into disrepair were ultimately demolished. Are there efforts now to perhaps save buildings that are at risk that with a little care, with a little investment, could become naturally occurring affordable housing available for people who need it?
I have heard of some. I know right now there's an effort to sell, I think, about 150 lots to nonprofit developers. So it would be amazing to see the kind of capital we use to invest it in luxury neighborhoods, if we could use that to do exactly what you're saying. And I do want to mention that disinvestment is a key part of the gentrification process. So the difference between a neighborhood like Logan Square and Englewood is that we're farther along. We were already disinvested for decades, and so now the developers are able to come in, use their capital to scoop up land, right? But Englewood and neighborhoods that are disinvested are in an earlier stage of gentrification, but I truly believe that's where they're headed, and obviously we're seeing that happen in some neighborhoods on the south and west side, like Bronzeville, right?
Right. Jeremy, gonna come your way for this question. Incredible words you gave us earlier. One of the things that, even for casual observers of housing policy, is that the government, the federal government in particular, is no longer in the business of providing housing. You know, they've essentially, you know, kind of privatized it into the hands of individual landlords and others. In terms of, as you talked about, getting off of reliance on the private market to provide housing, what are the alternatives? Is it more brick and mortar public housing the way we saw, you know, maybe 20 or 30 years ago? What would you recommend be the direction that we move away from private market, but still providing particularly hard units for people to live in?
Yeah. So so I'm gonna shout out some folks that we're in coalition with, and I know Sophia and her folks at Acre are in coalition with, and it's the Homes Guarantee campaign, and I think there's some folks in the Chicago area that are also a part of this campaign, And really what it is a vision for that. It is a vision for a, a, a guaranteed home for every person living in this country. And what we know historically is that when we say every person, that means a special emphasis on Black and brown folks who have been systemically and systematically blocked out of housing. But what that means is creating a stock of housing that is not subject to the whims of the private market. Now, someone may say, you mean more public housing? Well, some of it will be public housing, but some of it hopefully is community owned housing. Some of it hopefully is community land trusts, co-ops, things that are governed and democratically run by the folks in community. Now, this sounds like, pie in the sky stuff to an American audience, but this is the way housing is built in other parts of the world. Across Europe, there is social housing across Europe and it is not just for the very lowest income people. Place like Singapore, which has the most billionaires per capita in the world, has social housing. So the key thing is to have some set of housing that's off the private market, because one thing that we know when we have publicly owned utilities is that they compete with the private market in a way that actually gets better behavior in the private market. A good example of this is we have a postal service that is nationalized, and it impacts the rates at which FedEx, UPS, and other parcel services charge. There's been analysis done around universal health care in other countries and the way that that regulates the private market. So I think that there is something here that can be done to create housing that is safe, affordable, quality for people, so that they have that safety, security of a roof over their head that is actually going to have beneficial impacts on the housing market as a whole.
Great, thank you for that. Sophia, we haven't forgotten about you. Gonna throw something your way here. Talking about the private market, and as we're moving or trying to move in a direction that Jeremy is pushing us in, we're still at this point reliant on what the private market is doing. Are there things that we should be doing to actually get what we truly need from the private market? Right now we've got AROs, and we've got, Christian talked about the billions of dollars that we give to developers. It's kind of a carrot and stick approach, and we're still not necessarily getting exactly what we need. Are there alternatives to make affordable housing a more attractive option for private developers to provide for people? Do you have any thoughts or ideas or strategies that would help in that direction?
Got it. I will be very clear. I didn't hear every single word of the question, so I will do my best. And if there's more that I don't answer, just let me know, and I'm happy to do that. But I come down really close to Jeremy's response on this question because I also am part of this broad coalition of people who support the Homes Guarantee and this vision for community-owned housing. But I think your question is spot on. We're not there today, right? So what are the things between that alternate reality and the situation where we're in, where people are paying too much of their income on rent, and have to make the kinds of choices about their finances that really nobody should have to? In my own community, like I said, I live in San Antonio, Texas, and there are all kinds of opportunities and moments where there is capital that exists to be invested in affordable housing and in community-owned housing, like my co-panelist was naming earlier with the Lincoln Yards example. My own community is about to float a housing bond for $150 million. And by and large, that's going to be spent on public-private partnerships. But my critique would be, given that it's public money, what is it that we're really getting on the other side, when we could compare those kinds of public-private investments with things that would look like truly community-owned housing? I think let's set a little bit more of a standard and a North Star for ourselves and the kinds of things that we want to get from our public dollars. There are examples today, right, of people who have community land trusts. Not all models are created equal, right? But I think that I like to remind people that social housing does exist in this country. It's in little pockets here and there, right? But this isn't some like faraway dream that we can't possibly have. There are people doing it every single day. And I think we need to nurture that, invest in it. And I think, and when I say invest, I don't mean private investment that seeks to extract profit from it. I mean, invest public dollars that help guard those instances where people are practicing democratic models of living with one another. So I know it sounds a little bit pie in the sky, but I always want to just encourage us to remember that it's here now. We just need to make sure that we are building on it and also sharing the places where it exists. Actually, I'll just say really quickly to wrap up, I have been working with a couple of people in the Twin Cities, and there's a beautiful article written about them actually a year ago about them taking their landlord to court, right? So they evicted him. And it was like a ton of abuses that this landlord was perpetrating. And they basically sued him and they got him to give up the building. Actually, it's a set of 5 buildings. So those tenants own their homes today and they do it in a democratic way. And it's hard, but they wouldn't have it any other way, from what I'm told. So just want to share that there are ways of making those models more public, amplified, and things that people can more easily access and start to dream a little bit bigger about the housing situation we have today.
Great, thank you so much for that. Very detailed. Jeremy, we're going to come back to you. We've got a question from the audience, and by that I mean we got a question from Jawanza. This one is, and it's related to some of what Sophia was just talking about. But how are you distinguishing social housing from public housing? And then I've got a follow-up. Exactly how would it work?
Okay, yeah. So it's hard to hear distinguish between social housing and public housing. Yeah, that's the okay. So I want to be careful about how I answer this question, because what I don't want to do, and I don't want anyone to walk away with, is like, oh, Jeremy just crapped on public housing, because we need quality public housing and we need more of it. Okay, so this is an and conversation. We need quality public housing for very low income people that is affordable, that is tied to their income rather than than market rents. We need that, and we need more of it in our community. Well, I'd say the way I distinguish between the two. So let me start with the similarities. The similarities are both of them are largely publicly financed, right? Because they're not dependent on private return on investment in order for them to exist, in order for them to be maintained and sustained over time, and for them to be held together as quality housing for people. So that's where they're similar. What I'd say distinguishes them a bit from public housing is, and I'll say public housing in the model in which the USA has chosen to do it. One, it hopefully isn't segregated in communities by race, which is how we've decided to locate public housing throughout the history of this country. That social housing is something that is spread across communities, spread across regions, is in all parts of communities, all parts of regions, and is really part of the fabric of that community. So that's kind of one. The other thing that I'd say distinguishes from our traditional methods of providing public housing is that let's be honest, 50%, almost 50% of Black people spend more than 30% of their income on rent. So there's a huge delta between the very low income people that qualify for public housing and that number of people. So there's a lot of Black people who are living in unaffordable housing with absolutely no subsidy and no help. And I believe that social housing could be a solution to help those people, to help people who are working class, aren't raking in a lot of income, are struggling in the economy, and they're paying 50, 60, sometimes 70% of their income for a 2-bedroom apartment. And those are the people that could be benefited from the existence of an alternative to what's in the private market. Because what's in the private market for those folks are probably doubling up, maybe tripling up with folks living in substandard housing that is crumbling and falling apart, and they have no alternative to go anywhere else, so they're stuck in that. And hopefully that social housing can provide that. So the two differences and distinguishing things that I'd say is, one, it's not segregated by race in a region, and that it is something that is available to people who currently don't really get any sort of housing subsidy, because either it's weird to say that they're too rich, say, to get public housing, but too poor to get any other type of support from the government.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for that. We are now apparently in the Jawanza talking to the panelists virtually section of the program. Sophia, our esteemed host, has a question for you. Going back to the private market being a bit of a dilemma, he says, can you talk about the role of private equity in the housing market?
I think I heard, can I talk about the role of private equity in the housing market? Yes, okay, got it. I got confirmation. Yeah, I would be happy to. And I will flag, I unfortunately will have to leave after this question. I mentioned to Jawanza earlier when we spoke, I'm actually testifying tomorrow at a Senate committee hearing about this very topic. And so need to get back to my preparations. But I would characterize private equity very generally as this kind of massive shadowy force that exists and funds so many of the things that we depend on to live. So that could be housing. Jeremy mentioned private utilities earlier. Plenty of private equity firms are invested in private utilities. Basically anywhere where they see an opportunity to extract profit. And people in the audience may have heard of some of the bigger private equity firms. Blackstone, I think, is the one that probably gets the most attention, if you've heard that name before, particularly in housing. But folks smarter than me have distilled the way that they operate as loading companies up really heavily on debt, maximizing efficiencies. So when it comes to housing, that means including things like fees into people's lease contracts, and also skimping on costs, cutting costs, right? So here that means getting rid of any maintenance that they might be doing. So this exists all throughout the housing sector and all of the various subsectors. So there's single family rental, there's multifamily subsidized and unsubsidized, there's senior housing, there's student housing, there's assisted living facilities, and just go on and on down the list. And private equity exists in every single one of these subsectors. And you'll see those characteristics that I just described in every single one of those subsectors. So not only is it these private equity companies owning people's apartment buildings, but it's also they're behind financing that actually helps those apartment buildings get built in the first place. So you may not always have a private equity company as your landlord, but often they were involved in the actual construction or helping to finance some of the costs that your landlord might have. So in one way or another, I mean, I think even people who are homeowners probably private equity finance the development of your for sale single family home, right? In one way or another, we all feel the effects of private equity, whether it's us personally or in our homes ourselves. So to me, this is another one of those situations where it's really important to understand the kind of convoluted structures that private equity uses to kind of hide themselves and their responsibility. So for example, I was talking to someone who told me their landlord is like 77PW LLC. And I'm sure any of us in the housing justice space have seen those kinds of names before. The reality is it's usually private equity who's hiding behind those weird strings of consonants. And one of the many calls I plan on making in my testimony tomorrow is that we need more transparency so that landlords and their financiers can't hide in those kinds of ways. But above all else, to curb the kinds of abuses I named, we need tenant protection. So we need things like rent control, we need right to counsel, we need protections from fines and fees, and you could go on down the list. There's definitely more than that. But anything that helps to curb the role of private equity in our homes helps every tenant and every homeowner in this country be more stably housed, pay less of their income on rent, all of those kinds of things. So that was probably a very lengthy answer. Clearly, I've been thinking about this topic a lot recently. I'm happy to take any follow-ups if there are. Otherwise, I'll probably need to sign off pretty soon.
No, Sophia, that was a great answer. Thanks so much for being with us this evening, and yeah, good luck. Good luck with everything tomorrow.
Thanks, my pleasure. Talk to you all later.
All right. So we'll reminder to our audience members. Any questions? Please raise your hand. We'll get those in. We're going to come back to our in-person folks for a couple of quick questions. Christian, I remember a Chicago alderman named John Arena, who championed an affordable housing development and paid mightily for it at the next election in 2019. Did that have a chilling effect, you think, with regard to Chicago aldermen supporting affordable housing? And then what are your thoughts about trying to gain more allies on that particular body with regard to supporting affordable housing initiatives?
Yeah, I wouldn't say the outcome of that election sent shockwaves to the area of Chicago that we work in, because we understand that Chicago is a very segregated city. And that's not just in terms of race or income, but also in terms of political views. And so knowing the constituents that live in that ward, it was not surprising to me at all, especially hearing the stories from the organizers who were moving that project forward, the threats they received, the animosity they received. It was not that outcome was not surprising. And in terms of the effect it has on other aldermen and whether or not they're willing to be allies for affordable housing, the truth is that in Chicago, only 30% of folks, eligible voters, vote, and we need to do something about that, because the people who ultimately decide what our built environment is like and who has housing are the people we elect. And so we need to build more power. I mean, one point I think I want to make today is that Chicago is majority black and brown. Right? And right now, with this discussion on remapping, the conversation is, are the brown alders going to lose wards? Are the black alders going to lose seats? And we're the majority. We should be running the city. We should be making decisions about this budget. So I'm not too concerned about what's happening in Jefferson Park, because we're so busy building power in our neighborhoods, and so many other amazing groups are as well.
Michelle, I'm going to come to you. Sticking with aldermen for a moment. In Chicago, they have this thing, aldermanic privilege, prerogative, what have you. So there's a development that comes up in an alderman's ward. The alderman doesn't want it, and the rest of the council goes along with it. Is that practice, that longstanding practice, a real impediment to affordable housing, particularly affordable housing in communities where we don't see it typically? Is that a practice that needs to be defeated in order to really advance getting affordable housing citywide?
Oh, I absolutely think that it's a detriment to affordable housing and to integrating housing. And our organization, and me personally, am involved in the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, which has issued a report on aldermanic prerogative and the problem that it is caused in housing development. I think it's one of the many, to use a term, sort of old boy network things that keep just, keep us from moving forward on a lot of progressive ideals.
Okay, we are, as long as I'm not sure we've got a time check, we may be down to our last 5 minutes or so. We do have an audience question? Oh,
Just wanted to ask.
sure.
Kristen, I know you were saying that your family has had that building for quite a long time. Now, I know one of the regards is when they were ready to build Comiskey Park, they had 2 and 3 flat buildings on Windward and Will Street, and they bought those people out. Has anybody approached your family, like anytime realtor, to try and buy them out?
Absolutely. And people have even gone to my brother. The question was, are folks trying to buy my parents' 3 flat in Logan Square? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of money to be made flipping that kind of housing. What I'm happy to share is that a lot of folks, at least in the Hispanic community, we don't believe that the purpose of having a home is to make a return on an investment. I'm not going to speak for everybody, but for a lot of us, it's more important that we have a place that we can call our own with people that we love. And so that takes precedence over the profit that they could make. And I'm definitely a very loud voice in their life saying, no, you're not going to sell this house. No, you're not going to raise the rents, mom and dad. Yeah. So. But absolutely, people are definitely scavenging for that kind of housing. The sad part is that a lot of times, because of gentrification, those mom and pop owned 3 flats, those families feel forced to sell because they can't keep up with the property taxes. Then those families are displaced. The building's torn down, replaced with luxury housing, and then that makes it even more difficult for the next mom and pop 3 flat, right? So, and then the cycle continues.
We have another question. This one really is from the audience, from what I understand. This one is for any of our panelists. How would you make the case to elected officials and civic leaders that affordable housing is critical to economic growth?
Well, people who are spending more than, we'll take 30% because that's what, it's kind of a standard. People who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing aren't spending it on something else. And, part of the point that I've made about rental assistance is, you've got people on the other side and they don't like this handout to the tenants. Well, 90% of the rental assistance is going to landlords, and that's actually investment in our community, because that's money that will, the landlord gets the check, they're going to go to Home Depot or they're going to do whatever. Housing is an important, it's a huge part of our economy. And investment in people having stable housing is an investment in, making our communities more stable. Preventing people from being evicted, keeps their kids in school. It keeps them, being able to report to their job because they're not out trying to pack up and move to somewhere else in 14 days.
Christian, Jim, if either of you wanted to jump in on that one?
I'll jump in. I think you asked me to jump in. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, so I agree with everything that Michelle just said, and I do believe that housing everyone will create economic growth. But my challenge is that's not the reason why we should house everyone. The reason we should house everyone is because it is morally right thing to do. So, and that everyone should have a right to housing, and that housing should be a guarantee that everyone should be afforded in this country. So while I do believe, and for all the reasons that Michelle talked about, that everyone being stably housed will create economic growth, it'll make our economy more prosperous because people will be able to, because when people are feeling safe and secure, they're going to thrive economically. And then if people are thriving, the country thrives. that's still not the reason that we should do it. We should do it because it is a right that should be available to all people that live in this country.
Right.
I would also add to that. I mean, the economy has grown throughout the pandemic. It's grown throughout the last, since the 2008 crisis. What does that matter to me? What does that matter to you? So my message to the elected officials would be like, I don't care about economic growth, because as Jeremy has pointed out, the economic growth that we're talking about depends on harm toward Black and brown people. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in an economy of liberation, which is something that I've heard a lot from Jeremy. I'm a big fan. Liberation in a generation, hell yes. I'm so into that.
So we're winding down. We're going to move to our closing statements. Christian, since you're fired up, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I guess the last thing I'll say is that we really need to zoom out in terms of our historical lens when we're talking about housing. Because at least in the gentrification sphere, we talk about these problems like they're from this decade or the last decade. But really, gentrification is just the most recent iteration of the original sin that happened in this country when colonizers murdered the Native American people that lived on this land, and then created an economy based on land speculation. I mean, Andrew Jackson considered himself a land speculator. Our last president is a freaking developer. I guess we really need to zoom out in terms of our historical lens and think about an alternative. We need a new vision for the future and for the world, which again, shout out to Jeremy, because I really feel like he's doing a lot of great work on that front.
Thanks so much. Michelle, you have some closing thoughts for us today.
Well, one point I wanted to make, I listened to the testimony of a city council committee a couple of weeks ago where there was a subject matter hearing on the just cause for eviction ordinance. And one of the people from the real estate industry, and I'm not speaking badly of her, she just said, that's not how we think about property ownership. And she's absolutely right. That is not how we have thought about property ownership. But maybe we're at one of those moments where we're at the end of an era and a time where we're going to think about property differently. That living in a property, paying rent for so long. I represented a couple of voucher holders a couple of years ago who had lived with their voucher in the same property, two different tenants, both had lived there very long term, like 20 or 25 years. And that money went to someone to provide them housing. But what if the money had gone for them to own the housing? And I don't know. I'm a different generation, so I do have a different perspective. But I'm hoping that we're in one of those times of change, where we do look at property ownership differently, and hopefully it leads to looking at property in a more fundamentally fair way.
Great, thank you for those thoughts. Jeremy, we will have the last word from you this evening. Your closing thoughts for our audience tonight.
Thank you, and thank you for my fellow panelists. Thank you, Christian, for the very gracious shout out. Well, I'll say the way that I'll close is I talked a bit about the oppression economy and how the private market is basically privatized what I believe should be basic economic rights. And what I think the path forward to that long-term vision that we should all be aiming at is a liberation economy that where all people have their basic needs met, all people are safe and secure, all people are valued, and all people belong. And that is undergirded from a public policy standpoint on a set of guarantees, and a set of guarantees that all people in this country can look to their government to provide for them: an income, a job, healthcare, and a whole set of other things. But including in that set of guarantees is housing. because housing should be a fundamental right. It is a basic need that all people have. It is what they require them to be safe and secure in this country. And that should be the work. Now, it isn't going to happen overnight. There's a lot of steps that we have to take along the way to that long-term vision. But if we're diligent and we're doing our work and building the power that we know that we need to build, I believe that we can get there in our lifetime.
Perfect words to end on. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And please, audience, let's give a round of applause to our panelists. I want to thank you for being here, both in person and online, for the third and final part of our three-part series on changing the way forward, organizing, and policy reform. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, both in person and online. Again, thank you for being here, and good night.
What you need to lend a helping hand when you wake up, just know that we're always there. And when you call, we'll answer you and always get you through. It don't matter where you go, 'cause we're always there. Through the fire, through the change, we ain't afraid, gonna be here every day. We walk the miles, make the space, take the time, never late. We do it right. Always on your side. 'Cause we do it right. Any place, anytime, we're always there. Rain or shine. 'Cause we do it right. Take the lead and let it set you free. 'Cause when you need someone to trust, we are always there. Set your goals, live your dreams, you can always lean on me. In blue skies are gray, we are always there. And through the fire, through the change, we ain't afraid, gonna be here every day. We walk the miles, make the space, take the time, never late.